Hello and welcome to Macroeconomics Module 8, Lecture 5, our Introduction to the Federal Reserve System. In the last couple modules, we were talking about banking and how the banking, especially the fractional reserve banking system, can cause the money supply of the U.S. to go up or down. In fact, when you put currency into a checking account at the bank, because you still have the money in the form of a check, and the bank loans the cash out to somebody else, at least they keep a fraction but loan the rest out to somebody else, the money supply goes up. In a sense, the same dollar is owned by two people. You own it in the form of a check, and somebody else owns it in the form of cash, and you can both spend it. And you say, can this work? The two people have legal possession of the same dollar? And the answer is yes, as long as you both don't try to claim physical possession of the same dollar at the same time. And when you do that, that's what a run on the bank is. And then there's trouble. But usually there's not runs on the bank, and as long as the bank judges correctly how much it can safely lend out, this will work. And I will say, for statistical purposes, though I've just said in a sense both of you own the same dollar, that's not how it's counted. It is counted as each of you having a separate dollar, so that we say $2 exists, not $1 owned by two different people. Because it'd be a nightmare to track through who, statistically, to keep track of who owns what dollar. We'll just say they are separate dollars. Now, you might suspect that if the money supply going up and the money supply going down, I hope you realize it works the opposite way too. When you take cash out of the bank, you cause the money supply to go down. Now, how does that work? Because when you have your deposited cash in the bank loans it out, and those loans create additional money. When you pull your cash out, if the bank had loaned out to the limit of R, the required reserve ratio, now they've fallen below, or they don't have enough cash to support the loans, and what they have to do then is make less loans. They have to reduce loans. Normally, as the bank loans out your money and it's paid back, they just reloan it. But if you've pulled the cash out, when whoever borrowed that money pays it back, the bank would fall below R, and thus they have to hold some of it. So loans from the bank are reduced because they can't loan money you haven't put in there. And when loans from banks are reduced, the money supply goes down. Now you might ask, but what do the banks do in the meantime when you've withdrawn your cash and they've fallen below R, but the person hasn't repaid the loan, which in the long run will get them back to R? Well, you'll see the answer to that in this lecture. But if the money supply going up and down affects the macroeconomy, as it does, you might suspect the government's not willing to just let you cause the money supply to go up and down. They would want some control over it themselves, and they do. And hence, the government has created the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve System is the central bank of the United States. Now, almost all countries have a central bank. You don't have to have one. When this country was first created in 1789, we did not have one, but in the George Washington administration, we did create one. Though Andrew Jackson killed it off, and then from the time of the Andrew Jackson administration, the 1830s to 1913, we didn't have a central bank, and in 1913, Congress created, and President Woodrow Wilson signed the law to bring into existence the current Federal Reserve System, and we've had a central bank ever since then. And the central bank is something that countries create to regulate their banking system. Our Federal Reserve System is run by a Federal Reserve Board, and there are 7 members, and each member gets a 14-year term. They are appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate, like they would be for a cabinet position or for a Supreme Court position, with the difference that when you're on the Supreme Court, your term is life. You don't leave until you retire or die. If you're a cabinet position like Secretary of Defense or Secretary of Education, you can be fired at will by the president. These Federal Reserve Board members are in between. They don't have life terms, but they have 14 years. They can't be fired by the president in the meantime. You see the math here. If you have 7 members with a 14-year term, if the terms are properly staggered, you'd have someone coming up whose position would end and be appointed by the president every 2 years. It would be 8 years until the president had appointed 4 members. So if the president was making it his task to just appoint his lackeys who would do whatever he wanted, it would take him 8 years before he had a majority of the people on the board being his appointments. So these long terms give the board members a lot of independence. They're not worried about doing what the president wants or they'll lose their job. And they're not worried about, now Congress could change this whenever it wanted. So if they sufficiently ticked off Congress, they could change this. But in general, Congress doesn't mess with them very much at all. I think because Congress doesn't understand what they do. Now, I will also add that many board members don't stay 14 years. That's a long time. And these people are often, high bank executives, highly regarded economists, and they don't want to leave. If you're on the career path to be president of Chase Manhattan Bank, you don't want to go off to the Federal Reserve Board for 14 years. You want to go off for a few years because it looks really great on your resume, but then come back. Or if you're a highly regarded economist at Princeton trying to win the Nobel Prize, you don't want to go off to the Federal Reserve Board for 14 years. You want to do it for a few years and then come back and resume your career. Now, there is actually an exception to the 14-year term thing, and that is the chair of the Fed gets only a 4-year term. And the logic here being that each president gets to appoint the chair, which is a very important position. Current chair, who has been appointed by President Trump in his first term here, is Jerome Powell. And there he is, looking slightly odd and grandfatherly. His term as chair will, of course, end then in either Trump's second term or Joe Biden's first term, and then there will be a new appointment, which could be a reappointment. Now, what is the job of the Federal Reserve? Well, they have multiple jobs, but the big one, the one I'm going to spend all my time talking about this lecture and next lecture, is the Federal Reserve Board then controls the money supply of the United States. Now, how do they do this? There are 3 ways. The first is the Fed is the group that sets the required reserve ratio R. I talked about R like it was the bank's choice in my discussion last lectures, like the bank decided they have to keep 50% of their cash to be safe. But it's not actually the bank's choice, at least as far as the minimum you need to keep is the Fed's choice. The Fed sets the R. And as you change the R, you change the amount of money in the United States. Let's run through an example. Suppose banks have $1 million in vault cash in reserve and R is 15%. And we ask ourselves, what is the maximum amount of checking accounts or demand deposits that can be supported by this $1 million in cash? So we need that money multiplier formula. I'll remind you what it is. It's 1 over R. And that's how much in checks $1 in cash in the vault can create and then support. And so if that's $1, then to know how much amount of reserves greater than $1 would support, you take the 1 over R and you multiply it by the amount of vault cash. In this case, we're saying $1 million cash in the vault times 1 over 0.15 equals 6.67 million. So that $1 million in vault cash can support up to $6.67 million in checks existing. Now let's say the Fed wants more money created. So they lower R from 15% to 12.5%. Now when you do the 1 over R formula, you You always use the decimal, not the percent. So you wouldn't say 1 over 12.5, you'd say 1 over 0.125. So now we're going to have $1 million times 1 over 0.125, or 1 million divided by 0.125. And what do you get? 8 million. So we've just increased the money supply by 20%, assuming that the banks are loaning out to the max and everyone who borrows puts it all back in the bank. Because what happens is, when the banks have $6.67 million worth of checking accounts at the bank, they need $1 million in cash to back that up. And so they can't loan out any of that million in cash anymore. But when R is lowered to 12.5%, they don't need that much cash. They don't need the full million. They have excess reserves. And thus they're free to loan out, which if they get, will increase the money supply. If they get it back in a new checking account, loan it out again, the money supply goes up again, and they can play this loan out, get back, loan out game until they have created enough checking accounts that they need all of the $1 million. And at 12.5% required reserves, that means when checking account value has risen to 8 million, 8 million times 0.125 is 1 million, they have to stop loaning out the cash. So by lowering R, the Fed basically gives bank excess reserves they can loan out, and the money supply goes up. And then by raising R, they force the banks to loan out less of their vault cash and hold more just sitting in the vault, and the money supply goes down. So lowering R increases the money supply over time. Doesn't happen in one day. It takes a period of loaning out, getting back, loaning out. And raising R decreases the money supply over time. So this is a very powerful way of changing the money supply. Maybe a little too powerful in that the Fed doesn't like to use it too much. And the reason they don't like to move R around a lot is these are legal targets that the banks have to meet. So if the bank has arranged its loans and the amount of vault cash, so it's meeting the required R of 12.5%, and then the Fed raises it to 15%, suddenly the bank's out of compliance. They have to scramble to come up with vault cash somewhere. And if they do that, and then the Fed lowers it down to like 13% again, banks are going, Fed, stop moving this target around. You're driving us crazy. So the Fed likes to give banks a nice stable R target to look at, to aim for. It's not that they never move it, but they move it rather infrequently. Second way for the Fed to control the money supply is to raise and lower the discount rate. What is the discount rate? The discount rate is the interest rate that the Fed charges banks to borrow from the Fed. Now, why would a bank want to borrow money, cash from the Fed? And the answer is to get quick cash back to be in compliance with R. I've mentioned a couple times here the dangers of the banks falling below R, and if they do that, they need quick vault cash. Where do they get quick vault cash? One way to get it is to borrow it from the Fed. The Fed will lend banks the cash they need to put in the vault to meet the R requirement, but they don't get it for free. They have to pay an interest rate, and that interest rate is called the discount rate. Now, the higher the interest rate is, the higher the discount rate is that banks are going to have to pay, the more the banks will try to avoid borrowing from the Fed. Now, how do you avoid borrowing from the Fed? You avoid borrowing from the Fed by not falling below R. And how do you avoid falling below R? You keep a safety margin. If the Fed has set R at 18%, you don't loan out the max, so your vault cash is exactly at 18%. Because if that's true, you're in danger. If one big borrower doesn't repay on time, you've fallen below R, you have to borrow from the Fed. No, you sort of set a personal R of 18.5%. And then if some people don't pay back, that's okay. Your reserves fall from 18.5% to 18.2%. But hey, that's still above 18%. So the higher the discount rate is, the greater the safety margin of excess cash banks keep in the vault. And thus that tamps down on the loaning out, getting back game, because banks aren't loaning out as much as they legally could. You see how this functions similar to an increase in R and a decrease in R as far as affecting the money supply. By raising the discount rate, instead of forcing banks to keep more in the vault and not lend it out, the Fed is just encouraging banks to do so. And the Fed moves this around a lot more than R because it's easier for the banks. It doesn't have to force them to hold more by raising R, and that throws them out of compliance. By raising the discount rate, the banks voluntarily choose to hold more in their vault, and they can do that over a period of time, which is convenient to them. And when the Fed lowers the discount rate, they're saying to banks, go ahead, loan out to the max. If you fall below R through a miscalculation, no big problem. You can just borrow from us what you need to be back in compliance with R. You don't have to pay very much interest at all. So lowering the discount rate increases the money supply. Another interest rate you hear a lot about is called the federal funds rate. What is the federal funds rate? That is the interest rate that banks charge each other. Another way to quickly get in compliance with R by getting quick vault cash is not to borrow from the Fed, but borrow from another bank that has a little extra. And the interest rate banks charge each other on these short-term loans, often they're just overnight loans, to get in compliance with the R requirement is the federal funds rate. Your textbook questions the effectiveness of the Fed changing the discount rate because most banks actually borrow and lend in the federal funds rate, meaning they borrow and lend from each other rather than the Fed. And it is true. If the Fed raised the discount rate and banks could just keep borrowing from each other at the same old federal funds rate, that would be ineffective. But the Fed knows this. And while legally the Fed doesn't set the federal funds rate, banks choose what to charge each other. In practice, if the Federal Reserve Chair calls up Bank of America and says, we're raising the discount rate, we'd like you to raise the federal funds rate too, it is unlikely that the president of Bank of America is going to say no to the chair of the Fed. So they move together, and the Fed controls the discount rate and heavily influences the federal funds rate. Here we see the federal funds rate from 2000 to 2013. And if you can't see the dates at the bottom, it goes to zero or next to zero. That's October 2008. That's the start of the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, 2010. The Fed is lowering R close to zero, lowering the discount rate close to zero, telling banks, loan out the most you can. If you fall below R, no problem. We'll loan you money for nothing. And you see it kept at zero for 5 years, which is very unusual. Now, why did the recession last so long? Well, we'll talk about that in a future lecture, in the next module. But that's how the Fed fights recessions. They lower the discount rate and the federal funds rate really close to zero. Encourage banks to loan out money that hopefully people will use to buy things, and then aggregate demand will increase as the money supply increases. And if you're curious what the Fed is doing now with the federal funds rate, just like the Great Recession of 2009, 2010, they've reduced it to be next to zero because they're worried the coronavirus will cause a big bad recession. And so they're trying to encourage banks to loan out so people have money to spend, so stores have customers, and we don't get a big recession. And they'll probably keep it at 0.25% until the threat of the virus to the economy is over. We'll talk about the third way that the Federal Reserve Board controls the money supply next lecture. Until then, take care.